I wanted to start by showing you just, a couple, how do I get rid of this? Okay. A couple of pictures about my university. I teach in California, and fortunately, Channel Islands is not on an island. It's actually 60 kilometers north of Los Angeles, and behind me is the library of my university, which was designed by Norman Foster. It's the newest addition to the Costache system in California. It opened in 2002. October 21st, 2019. With much fanfare and plenty of online projects, preparing the grand opening day was set for the newly redesigned and reorganized MoMA, a true testimony of the new digital age. I get to see something different on my screen, that's why I turned around. A true testimony of the new digital age. An invitation was sent via Facebook for a free preview day, a day early, on Sunday, October 20th. The large crowds that showed up confirmed the power of the social media. This response is a far cry from the lamentations of the modern artist at the dawn of last centuries. Decades later, postmodernism echoed these views. And again, I apologize for the text being a little more cubist than I intended. Decades later, postmodernism echoed these views. The abundance of theoretical inquiries and critical examinations of museums led to multiple and very positive changes that redefined both the physical spaces and the narrative. It is not difficult for museums to provoke criticism. Since their more official inception in the late 18th century, the museum has been and continues to be the most trusted source for showcasing great art, and its role has an impossible task: to use expert knowledge to please both scholars and the general public. How do you preach to the choir while pleasing the congregation? But the greatest challenge for museums has been the electronic, digital, and social media. Early on, museums questioned the value of the internet. What is it supposed to be? What is its purpose? An advertising for the institution or a replacement of the visit? After all, museums are concerned with originals, not reproductions, which is beautifully illustrated by this work by Rauschenberg, which was commissioned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art for its centennial. Even though the question remains somewhat unresolved and the answers are ambiguous at best, museums quickly realized that a savvy and noticeable presence within the digital landscape is a must for their survival in this new century, and in particularly for connecting with new generations of visitors. In an incredibly rapid fashion, museums have embarked on an effective crusade to catch up with the digital factor and have done a superb job. The online presence, a reflection of the institutional profile, but also a sign of graphic design trends, has been recently enhanced by familiar logos that we all know. A value-added component, to use a business term, to the digital identity of museums. I'm speaking to you today as an outsider of the museum world, an art historian and a faculty, or to use a proper IT term, a user. As a faculty, I'm impressed by the educational tools museums have provided to students and general public, and mesmerized by their inventiveness and scholarship. As an art historian, I'm envious and disappointed at the same time that my field has not reached the same level of engagement with the digital age. The inspiration for my title is Malraux's. What happened? Okay, went too fast. That's how life goes. The inspiration for my title is Malraux's book, which actually it's another example of how translations are actually interpretation and alterations, because the same paper would not work very well in French, or at least it would work differently. A text that perceived photography, a very, very distant relative of the internet or digital media, as a key factor for reassessing art, its history, and dissemination. Technology has drastically changed since 1947, and unimaginable possibilities brought about unforeseeable challenges. My paper reflects on three key aspects that have transformed the museum in the digital age. These three components are intimately intertwined, overlap, and affect one another. As mentioned in my abstract, I use for this analysis a business model called SWOT. As I'm not sure if you're familiar, I included the definition of the acronym on the screen. A crucial component for all aspects of digital media, and for many other things actually, is money. And smaller museums and other cultural institutions have very limited funds for innovative and particularly innovative digital projects. Therefore, I focused my research on large museums, many of which, and again, sorry for the graphic changes, many of which I use regularly either in my courses or in my work. Others were selected from these top most visited museums in the world. And one comment I just wanted to make, I did not include it in my paper, is that over 2/3 of these museums are either from the Western world or use Western art. So there is another completely different issue which I wanted to include. I realized I'm not going to make it within 25 minutes. But it's an important issue regarding the digital media and museums. My analysis and reflections take also into account my course project and student responses, which sometimes are absolutely astonishing and surprising. The first encounter with the museum with the Museum Without Walls is very likely to be its website. The initial connection is an important one. Unlike the architectural identity of museums, which cannot be easily changed for very obvious reasons, the web aesthetics are short-lived and require constant updating to reflect current web design trends and include technological developments that optimize users' experience. I'm not talking about the slides in particular. These IT needs and the one-size-fits-all web templates erase some of the institutional identity, even its history, as very evident in these slides, that all the websites look very much alike. Without the name, would anyone be able to recognize the museum based solely on the website? Visual sameness permeates contemporary life and culture, and now includes also web design for museums. There are numerous advantages to accessing museums anytime from almost anywhere, but there are also problems. So I'm going to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats for each of these three components. As far as strengths, the benefits of a museum without wall is certainly this incredible access 24/7. In this environment, the museums actually seem to keep a certain sense of authority. They control the narrative, as the options that the viewer has are limited to what is being offered. And interestingly enough, the museum online visit is also giving the viewers a sense of empowerment, a path they can select, which makes that visit very pleasant and less intimidating than the one in the museum. What I think is particularly relevant, and it might not be necessarily for the general public, they may not be aware that this is not in the museum, but the extent of art that can be viewed online that it's not available, art that is literally not on view, but also access to archived exhibition. This is an exhibition. There are a lot of museums that do this. This is from the Getty. It's the inaugural exhibition in 2000 when they opened. And then there are also exhibitions specifically designed to be online. I simply selected one from the Uffizi. Many museums do that. The weaknesses as far as a museum without without walls is the most obvious one, which I didn't even include in the slide, is you're missing the real life experience. And you can't go on and on to saying how important that difference is of looking at your screen rather than being inside a room. There is also the inability of museums to control basically the path of the viewers and the visitors. There are technical limitations, and I talk again when I talk about art without frames. It's much easier to reproduce a painting or a print to digital media. It's a very different story for video, installations, non-Western art, performances. So there are some limitations to how and what can be viewed online. Copyright issues I'm not dealing, but they are in themselves an important issue. And also the need to constantly create new projects, which have two major components that present problems. One, they have to be innovative, not in terms simply of the content, but also in comparison to other digital projects, not necessarily even connected to museums or art, but in general, so they live in the digital world. And secondly, they create a need for constantly visual updating. Digital media has a very short-lived visually life, so that brings, I think, the most important. I'm not a business faculty, but I understand finances. And when you have a huge component of having to do new things, costs become a major issue. It's great for students now because there are new jobs in museums that deal with digital media that they can actually apply for. But for museums, I'm sure it's a significant problem. Museums provide a wealth of information, but an effective search online requires a level of knowledge or interest, and I'm showing you two examples from the National Gallery, to produce meaningful results. How does the general public search for an artist or artwork if not familiar with the museum or art in general? Is the term curatorial department a user-friendly category the public would understand and venture to explore? And I also know from my students, when I assign certain projects, I give them no guidelines. They have to go straight to the website. They have to find. They have a very hard time finding the museum mission statement. Sometimes they can't find the works unless it's very precise. For me, I never encountered the problems because I know how to look. So clearly, it's a different kind of connection that a general public would have with the site itself. A narrative specific to the museum without walls is important, but it's also not overtly defined. As Keisha Hartning recently remarked, quote, for museums to actually extend the experience online beyond the walls or deliver online-only experiences, there is a need to define what is being delivered. And I think that is a very important issue of creating a narrative that is not simply either a copy or sort of an advertising for what can happen inside the museum. There are many opportunities for a museum without walls, and I think the most important ones, there are a lot more than I'm listing here, is basically introducing the museum to new constituencies, new audiences, disseminating art, because the wealth of information is absolutely incredible. And the ones that are also somewhat of a threat is connections with popular culture. The museum, the digital museum, the websites, the social media, all are now part of a digital context. And I think negotiating its identity, the museum needs to rethink, in a sense, how it's being perceived within basically a digital format. As I said, some of the opportunities, this encounter and dialogue with the digital landscape is somewhat also of a threat, and there are many issues that the museums need to reflect upon. There are also, in addition to that, there are many other options, other museums, other cultural institutions. There are the digital attractions, actually I used before the term temptations, are enormous. And while looking at a painting, you may decide you want to eat something and just move on and do something else. You can't do this inside the museum. Well, you can just, but you have to leave. The kind of attention that you have, the kind of, quote unquote, being trapped in a museum, it's not going to happen in a digital environment. So this is completely different. So on one hand, the museum keeps its authority, but it really can't control what viewers do and how the art is basically that heterogeneous space of the digital screen, basically. But I think in terms of the digital museum, the most important threats come from the technical part, not only in terms of cost, but in need to constantly change, update, include new links, which are problematic because sometimes you have a link, you go there and it tells you, you're having trouble. Or, as it happened to me last week as I was preparing this, that they did not believe I'm a human, so I had to verify that I'm a human. Well, for the general public, I'm not sure it's so encouraging to visit a museum when they think you're not even human, so let alone kind of understand the art. The SWOT analysis confirms that museums' digital presence remains a delicate balancing act. On one hand, its goal is to entice audiences to visit its space. On the other hand, however, its objective is to reach out to those who may not be yet interested or able to visit the museum in person. As Carla Everstein stated, quote, "The digital presence has the potential to be an experience in and on of itself, not a replacement for the physical museum." While different both in intent, both scenarios have a significant converging point. They aim to highlight the unique value of art, that obscure object of desire. But is this what users, visitors, want from a website? Research, as well as my student comments, suggest that the online visitors are mostly concerned with a site that would be, quote, "easy to navigate, click-friendly, and visually appealing." There is not a single word about content. What should visitors do? And sorry, the text is not fully here. I would kind of adapt Gertrude Stein's comment about how to visit a museum to a digital one. When in a digital museum, click slowly, but keep clicking. If clicking is now part of the new generation's DNA, museum visits are not. The new generations are, however, the future museum goers, the future art patrons, the future art supporters. How to engage them to come to the museum rather than go to the mall, see a movie, or play a video game, even one with art inside. In the US, College Night has been for more than 15 years a way of attracting students to museums, even though the long-term benefits of these projects are still unclear, and frankly, some museums have decided to give them up. The digital media might be the answer. When I recently asked my students in my introductory course, what do they perceive to be the most effective way to disseminate art and make it available to the public, about 80% of 100 students responded social media. It's an astonishing number. Recently, the Broad Museum in Los Angeles did just that, used Instagram as a way to lure visitors to their exhibition, and you see some connections and photographs. The idea raised both accolades and skepticism, and I'm well aware there are other museums doing the same kind of invitations to their exhibition. However, it was a success, measured in terms of high attendance and the willingness of visitors to wait for even 5 hours, granted it's Los Angeles and it's not cold, to enter the exhibition. It also demonstrated that social media could turn the museum into an influencer, such a popular term, that realigns the dialogues between art and viewers. As Anthony Gormley stated, what makes museums so valuable, it is not so much the conversation between the objects, but as between us and the objects. The potential of an audience without borders is both an incredible opportunity and an enormous challenge. I'm not going to talk about all the items that I have listed. I will mostly focus on the ability now for websites to connect with a really global audience by using an enormous amount of languages, and certainly makes it easy to go to countries where it's a language that you don't speak. English is often in many, many institutions, but there are some museums that have over 20 languages listed, which is truly, truly astonishing. For museums, it's easy to manage very large groups. what I think is particularly important is the kind of projects that the museums now develop outside the space, online, that create an incredible link and connection with the audience. This is one example from LACMA to collect and create. They also created a project where you can make your own books, you can make your own exhibition catalogs. Obviously, it's all fictional. These exhibitions don't happen except when you get the book to your house. And also, as I already mentioned, the dialogues with the social media, and unless, I don't know if you know, but very soon it's the annual Selfie Museum Day. And there are now selfie museums, actually. There are 2 already in Los Angeles. There are also weaknesses, and one of them, I think it's still an unclear sort of direction for the best practices. And these online engagements that I just mentioned, which I think are actually very positive, create expectations that are not possible in the museum. So if you make a book of various works of art from LACMA or the Getty or whatever, and you go to the museum and you try to do the same thing, or you try to touch even the painting, it's not going to happen. So it creates a disconnect between the museum visit and the online visit. And this is probably the very last item that I think it's essential in understanding the disconnect. The online visit is private and empowering. The museum visit is public and intimidating. Is the website preparing the online viewer, who might have never been to a museum, to that enormous transition? The photograph that you see there actually created a lot of stir about months ago when it was published, because it was a critique of people in museums watching something on their phones, but it actually got very much defended, saying that students are looking at apps and they're doing a project. So it's unclear what exactly is the truth, but nonetheless, it's clearly something we see quite often. The opportunities for an audience without borders is certainly getting bigger and bigger with new possibilities in terms of digital projects. And one that I want to mention, I know the Brooklyn Museum is not the only one doing that. In fact, I remember some years ago, European museums have done that as well, is using basically the audience to promote the museum. And I can tell you it's so effective for my students and that for the general public, because museums are intimidating for the general public. They seem to speak with a sense of knowledge, which certainly is very true. But having members of the audience talk about an exhibition gives everybody a sense of value, of the power of having a voice without feeling intimidated by, as you all know, maybe I'm wrong. So I found these very short clips, these videos, to be quite interesting in creating this link with the audience, where the museum is simply a mediator, an intermediary. And then the apps that we talked about in a minute. There are also important threats, the very social media languages, because few museums can afford a lot of languages to be included. I'm almost done. And the cost. And there is quite a bit now tools that are required require museums to measure and evaluate the experience of the visitors. I do have a little bit more time, right? Okay, because I thought I heard some, okay. An audience without borders is a complex issue that requires enormous labor, in-house or via specialized agencies, and new tools to analyze, understand, and manage the data. Using Google Analytics and other testing tools, museums aim to collect both qualitative and quantitative information. However, as Elena Villaspesa recently noted, these tools have limitations. They collect people's actions, but in many cases, there is a need for information to understand the full picture. Colin Brooks from the Whitney confirmed that seeing the results from using digital metrics is a gradual process. As these tools and data are limited to online visitors, the comments of the Metropolitan Museum Chief Digital Officer are very revealing. Quote, the museum's biggest competition in terms of audience isn't the Guggenheim or the Museum of Modern Art, but rather Netflix, Candy Crush, and a desire to stay home rather than explore the city. How do you entice this audience to visit the museum online or in real life? Let me end this segment with a positive quote by Renoir. If out of 1 million visitors, there is even a single one to whom art means something, that is enough to justify the museum. No financial department of a museum will go along with that, but you can use it if you need it. But what is there to see in an old picture, asked the futurist about 100 years ago? The answer is very obvious to specialists, but not to a younger global audience familiar with Banksy, but not Botticelli, an audience who questions Western culture, Western civilization, which has marginalized, and to a certain extent still does, included in the digital realm, histories, cultures, and artistic tradition. More importantly, what is there to see in the original or old picture when you can look at its reproduction on your phone? And I teach a couple of courses exclusively online, which have to be, this is kind of the direction my university is giving me, have to be optimized for phone use, not a computer. So there are actually a lot of tricks that I have to do so that the book is available that way. It's a new world. More importantly, so what if you have the reproduction on your phone? Today, most art is seen as a copy and very likely a digital one. Even with numerous innovative tools, developing an appreciation for the original is not only difficult, but I would say impossible online. Rather than focusing solely on the visual aspects, museums have done an extraordinary job of gathering a wide range of information, activities, and projects related to the work that expose processes, ideas, facts, materials that have significantly enhanced viewers' knowledge about art, and in the process, demystify the work of art for them. What are the strengths? And I have to limit myself to just a few because of the time. And I use museum projects a lot, and I think it's just incredible how much information there is. I think the areas that are the most valuable for the general public is basically opening up places and areas that are not available to the general public, such as conservation, storage. I know my students are just in awe when they discover all these things. But there is also an enormous amount of documentation, and this is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Makes it almost impossible for a student to do any research because the entire bibliography for a work of art is listed there. The entire history of the exhibition of that work is listed there. Provenance, there are audio files. And now the Museum of Modern Art and other museums have done this well. This is a documentation archival of, this is for the Starry Night by Van Gogh. It includes photographs of all the exhibitions in which this work was included since it was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in 1938. It's just incredible. I mean, it's just a resource that it seems almost impossible. And then new ways in which the museum's collections are intersected and connected, not just to the curators, but in this case to artists and other art experts, but not necessarily directly related to the museum. As far as weaknesses, I actually find very few. I think simply the fact that it is a reproduction, there are a lot of problems. Yes, it is. That was an exception in the Met that the frame was photographed. Art is without frames, and it gives you, this is from San Francisco Museum of Art. Just as in any art history course, be it a digital slide or any kind of slide or any reproduction, they sort of look alike. It's the same shape, the same line, the same color menu. And there is also, because they are seen online, there is this, what I call the cool factor of the digital media. They compete with a lot of other things. The opportunities include showing and presenting art in an interdisciplinary context. This is a scientist talking about Van Gogh's Starry Night, an actress talking about abstraction and Kandinsky. And I know it was mentioned before, and I'm sure it's going to be mentioned again, YouTube, which I think is one of the most incredible additions to the museum and to Art Without Frames. It is from all continents, an incredible opportunity to make art accessible, available, and to connect basically with the viewers, if you want, on their own terms, particularly for the new generation. And I mentioned more than one time the new apps. if the interest and the appreciation for the original is a little bit difficult to develop online, I think it's close to impossible, even with the Zoom and all that. What I think museums have done extremely successful and extremely well is develop an interest for art in general, which I would say it's even better, because it creates an interest and an interest to discover more and eventually come to the museums. There are also threats, but they're not a lot. The expectations that are not fulfilled when you come to the museum. You can't go to see the storage, and you can't go to the conservation lab. And the visual, basically, attributes, the digital attributes of the reproductions that may create certain expectation. They look very slick. They don't prepare you for a rough canvas, the texture of the pencil or the charcoal, and that's why I'm using a collage by Picasso. When you go and see it in real life, it's a different encounter. And for someone who has never seen that, it may look like an unfinished work. That is something that online it's really difficult to teach and to acquire, basically. The museums without walls, audience without borders, and art without frames have profoundly transformed the way the public as well as the expert connect and relate to art and museums. As the summary suggests, the strengths and opportunities significantly outweighed the weaknesses and the threats. Therefore, while museums continue to be built and collections expanded, the digital factor will continue to play a pivotal role in the 21st century. As a greater segment of the audience will be digitally native, museums will have to develop robust online narrative, not as mere supplements, but as viable standalone experiences. Museums are not solely for art historians and experts. Rather, they are institutions entrusted with enhancing knowledge and appreciation for all. The museum without walls should not be an end destination, but a beginning of a long journey on which the audience without borders would embark with enthusiasm, and where art without frames would provide the visual and conceptual incentives to transform the expectations for instant gratification into an aspiration for prolonged contemplation in the digital realm as well as inside the museum. Pictures, Mark Rothko said, and I would add, art museums must be a revelation, an unprecedented and unexpected resolution of an eternally familiar need. Thank you.